Imagine being locked in a cell no bigger than a bathroom. No window, no clock, no voice but your own. At first it's just quiet, but soon the silence starts to move, to whisper, to laugh. You begin to hear footsteps that aren't there, voices that call your name, until you can't tell what's real and what's in your head. This isn't a story about escaping chains or breaking walls. It's about fighting the one enemy no prison guard can protect you from, your own mind. When the iron door slammed shut behind him, Thomas felt the sound cut through his chest like a blade. It wasn't just a door closing, it was the world itself shutting him out. The echo rattled down the corridor and then faded, leaving behind a silence so heavy it seemed to smother the air. He stood there for a moment, stunned, staring at the concrete box that would now define his life. 4 walls, no larger than a bathroom, a thin iron cot with a mattress that sagged in the middle, a rusted toilet in the corner, a single light bulb overhead that hummed and flickered as though it was mocking him. This wasn't a room. It was a cage for the mind. At first, Thomas tried to tell himself it wouldn't be so bad. He was strong, he thought. He'd survived worse things outside these walls. Poverty, fights, the chaos of the streets. He had endured betrayal, hunger, and nights with nowhere to sleep. This was just another test. He even forced a laugh, trying to convince himself he could handle it. But as the minutes dragged on, that laughter felt foreign, almost absurd, bouncing off the cold walls with no warmth to carry it. He tried to occupy himself. He counted the bricks, tracing each crack with his eyes as though memorizing a map. He dropped to the floor and began doing push-ups, push after push until sweat dripped down his forehead. He paced back and forth, measuring the length of the cell with his footsteps. But the cell was too small, too suffocating. The walls closed in on him no matter how far he moved. His body could stay busy, but his mind screamed for release. That first night was the longest of his life. Thomas lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced under the flicker of the bulb. Every sound, no matter how small, exploded in his ears. The faint drip of water from a leaking pipe, the shuffle of rats in the corner, the distant clank of a guard's boots. Even his own breathing felt too loud, too invasive, like the sound of someone else in the room. He pressed his palms to his ears, but there was no escape. The silence wasn't silent at all. It was alive, pressing in from all directions, seeping into his skull. By morning, his eyes burned from lack of sleep. He told himself it was just one bad night. Tomorrow would be easier. But the second night was worse. The silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like a presence, a weight bearing down on him. He whispered just to hear something, anything, but his own voice came back to him distorted, hollow, as though the walls were mocking him. He longed for conversation, for another human voice, but all he had was his own echo. And that was when Thomas began to understand. His greatest enemy was not the guards outside or the iron door that locked him in. His greatest enemy was the silence itself. It was patient. It was merciless. And it wanted his mind. By the 3rd week, Thomas realized silence wasn't empty at all. It was a trickster. At first, it lulled him with stillness, but then it began to breathe with him, to whisper through the cracks in the walls. He would sit on his cot, staring into the dim light, when suddenly he'd hear it. A faint murmur, curling in the corner of the cell like smoke. He froze the first time it happened, his ears straining, his heart pounding. Thomas. The sound was so soft he thought it might have been a dream, or a memory sneaking back to him from the past. He sat up straight, eyes darting to every shadow, scanning for the source. But of course there was no one there. The door was sealed, the walls solid, the air heavy. He told himself it was his imagination, just the silence playing tricks on him. Yet when he closed his eyes again, the whisper returned, closer, clearer, like a breath against his ear. Sleep became impossible. Night stretched into endless battles. Each time Thomas tried to shut his eyes, the voice stirred, calling his name, mocking him, or worse, laughing. It wasn't the laugh of a friend or a stranger. It was his own laugh, twisted, hollow, echoing, back at him as if the walls themselves had learned his voice and were throwing it back in his face. During the day, he fought back. He tried to drown it out by singing old songs from childhood, scraps of melody he barely remembered. He recited poems he had memorized in school, repeated quotes from books, even replayed conversations he had once had with his mother. But no matter what he filled the air with, the silence swallowed it whole, then spat it back at him with distortions. His mother's kind words replayed as accusations. His father's advice rang in his ears like threats. What once had comforted him now twisted into poison. The voice grew bolder with each passing day. Sometimes it taunted him. "You will die in this box," it sneered. Other times it pretended to be his friend, speaking in a calm, reassuring tone as if it were the only company he had left. And Thomas, exhausted and desperate, began to respond. At first he shouted back, cursing the invisible tormentor. Later, his replies softened into bargaining, even pleading. "Stop," he whispered once, pressing his head into his hands. "Please, stop." And that was when fear sank into him like ice, because the moment he answered it felt real, too real. He realized he wasn't just imagining the voice anymore. He was inviting it in. It was no longer an echo bouncing off walls. It was something alive, growing inside him, feeding on his loneliness. Thomas sat there in the dim light, trembling, staring at the blank concrete wall. For the first time since his imprisonment, he wasn't afraid of the guards or the length of his sentence. He was afraid of himself, afraid that his mind, once his only refuge, was slowly turning against him. Thomas once believed that madness was something distant, something that happened to other people. It was the image of a raving man, hair wild, eyes wide, shouting at ghosts only he could see. He never thought it would creep in slowly, quietly, like a shadow stretching across the floor until it swallowed him whole. But inside the cell, madness wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. It lived in the small moments when he questioned what was real. He noticed the first crack one morning when he woke to find scratches on the wall he didn't remember making. They were jagged lines, overlapping tallies, some shallow, some deep, carved with what must have been his fingernails. He stared at them, his chest tightening. Had he done this in his sleep? Or had someone else been there? The rational part of his mind said it had to be him. But another voice whispered, "What if it wasn't?" From then on, he began to distrust himself. He'd find the cot shifted slightly, though he swore he hadn't moved it. The water in the toilet rippled, though no one had touched it. He once caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye, a shadow darting across the wall. He spun around, fists clenched, only to find nothing. The room looked exactly the same as it always had, still, gray, lifeless, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen shared the space with him. Loneliness began to carve holes in his memory. He tried to keep track of time, scratching marks on the wall for each day, but the marks blurred together. Sometimes he forgot whether he had already made one. Other times he lost whole hours staring blankly into space only to wake up and realize he didn't remember what he had been thinking. He began to fear sleep, not because of nightmares, but because he no longer trusted what he might do. When his eyes closed, the voice grew cleverer. It no longer whispered just his name. It imitated sounds, footsteps, keys jingling, even the soft laughter of his younger sister. Once he swore he heard his mother's voice, warm and familiar, calling him to dinner. His heart leapt, his eyes filled with tears, and for a moment he almost believed he wasn't in the cell anymore. He smelled roasted chicken, bread, the faint sweetness of apples. But when he blinked, the smell was gone. Only concrete, only dust. The memory had betrayed him. In desperation, Thomas began speaking out loud constantly, narrating everything he did. "I'm standing, I'm walking, I'm drinking water." He spoke as if to anchor himself to reality, to remind himself he still existed. But as the days wore on, he realized he was no longer narrating for himself. He was narrating for the voice. He could feel it listening, feeding on every word, every fear. One night, lying on his cot, Thomas whispered into the darkness, "Who are you?" For a long time there was only silence. Then, faint and sharp, came the reply, "I'm you." Thomas pressed his hands over his ears, but it didn't matter. The voice wasn't outside him anymore, it was inside. By the time the 4th month blurred into the 5th, Thomas understood that survival inside the cell wasn't about food or water. The prison gave him those in meager portions: stale bread, thin soup, water in a dented tin cup. His body could live on scraps, but his mind was starving. Starving for light, sound, human touch. Every day felt like walking a tightrope over a pit, and each time he closed his eyes, he felt himself slipping. He realized he had two choices: surrender to the voice or fight it. And fighting meant creating something to hold on to. So he began, building worlds inside his head. He closed his eyes and pictured streets from his childhood, the cracked sidewalks, the corner store where he used to steal candy, the laughter of kids running with sticks as swords. He walked through those streets, in his imagination, naming every window, every door. He rebuilt the house he grew up in, room by room, remembering the creak of the staircase, the scratchy couch fabric, the smell of his father's cigarettes. For hours, he lived in that memory palace. It was fragile, flickering, but it gave him something the cell could not: freedom. When the voice interrupted, mocking, telling him it was useless, he spoke back, not with fear, but with defiance. "You don't own me," he said into the silence. "You're not real." But the voice was cunning. It laughed, soft and low, and whispered, "If I'm not real, then why are you talking to me?" Sometimes, the voice won. On his weakest days, Thomas broke down, sobbing into his hands, begging it to leave him alone. He hated himself in those moments, hated the trembling, desperate sound of his own pleas. But other times he found strength he didn't know he had. He invented routines: exercise in the morning, memory building in the afternoon, quiet reflection at night. He counted his breaths, meditated on the rhythm of his heartbeat, used his body as an anchor to reality. Still, cracks showed. He began, carving words into the wall, not just tallies but messages. "I am here. I am alive. This is real." His fingernails bled, his fingertips raw, but the marks gave him proof that time was passing, that his mind hadn't fully drifted away. Whenever he doubted, he touched the words with trembling fingers and whispered them aloud, like prayers. Yet even as he fought, the darkness pushed back harder. One night the voice returned stronger than ever, not a whisper now but a roar that filled the cell, mocking, jeering, repeating his worst memories until he curled up on the cot, rocking like a child. He covered his ears, but it was inside him, buzzing through his skull. When it finally stopped, he lay there in silence, shaking, and that was when he made a quiet vow. If they wanted to break his body, fine, but they would not take his mind. He would fight, every day, every hour, every breath. Not for freedom, not for justice, not even for hope. He would fight simply to exist. Because if he surrendered, if he gave in to the voice, then the cell wouldn't just be his prison, it would be his grave. Thomas no longer knew how many months or years had passed. Time was a blur, a river with no banks carrying him forward whether he wanted it to or not. His beard had grown wild, his clothes hung loose on his thin frame, and his skin was pale from the lack of sunlight. But his eyes burned with something the walls could not take, a flicker of defiance. The voice still haunted him. It came and went, sometimes cruel, sometimes seductive, always testing the fragile edges of his sanity. There were days it felt stronger than him, filling his head with venom until he thought he might break apart. But there were also days, rare, precious, when he managed to silence it. On those days he sat on the floor with his back against the wall, closed his eyes, and breathed. In, out, in, out. The rhythm of life itself became his shield. Thomas discovered something powerful in the silence. Imagination wasn't just escape, it was survival. He built stories in his head, entire novels only he could hear. He gave himself characters, voices, conflicts, endings. He created people to talk to, not the cruel voice that mocked him, but friends, allies, companions. He ate meals with them, laughed with them, even wept with them. In the bleakest hours, those voices were more real than the guards who slid food through the slot. But the battle was never easy. There were nights he woke screaming, clawing at the walls, convinced he was buried alive. There were mornings he stared at his reflection in the steel toilet, unable to recognize the hollow-eyed figure staring back. The cell wanted him broken, empty, nothing. Yet even when he trembled, even when tears soaked his face, Thomas clung to a single, unshakable truth. As long as he could think, as long as he could imagine, he was still human. One evening, as the dim bulb flickered overhead, he whispered something new into the silence. Not a plea. Not a bargain. Just 4 words. You will not win. The voice hissed back, laughing, but Thomas smiled faintly. He had learned its greatest weakness. It only lived if he fed it, and he was done feeding it. From then on, he treated every day like a test. His body was frail, his heart heavy, but his spirit stood firm. He carved new words into the wall. Hope lives here. He spoke them each morning as if they were sacred. And slowly the voice grew weaker. It never vanished completely, but it no longer owned him. When the guards finally opened his door, whether after years or decades, he couldn't tell. Thomas stepped into the light, shielding his eyes against the brilliance of the sun. His legs wobbled, his lungs burned with fresh air, and tears streamed down his face. He wasn't free of scars. He knew the voice would follow him for the rest of his life. But he had survived. Not by chains, not by force, but by the stubborn will to remain human in a place designed to strip humanity away. The cell had tried to bury him, but Thomas walked out alive. And in survival, alive was enough. In the end, Thomas didn't escape his cell with force or cunning. He survived because he refused to let the silence define him. The voice in the dark never truly disappeared, but it lost its power the moment Thomas stopped feeding it with fear. His body came out thinner, weaker, scarred by years of isolation. But his spirit? His spirit walked out unbroken, and that is the truth of psychological survival. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with fists or weapons, but in the quiet corners of our own minds. Thomas's story reminds us that even in the darkest prisons, hope can be carved into the walls, and a human soul can endure what seems impossible. Because survival isn't always about escaping death. Sometimes survival is simply choosing, again and again, to stay alive in the silence.